Chapter 22. Bright light flashed inside Brian's eyes, red and glaring, and he opened them to find that he was on his back, staring directly at the sun. Ugh. He rolled onto his stomach and spit and nearly choked on water. He was in the shallows below the rapids, caught up in a small alcove on the shoreline. The water was 6 or 7 inches deep, with a gravel bottom. His senses returned, and with them came the realization that he was all right. He was bruised, but nothing was broken. He had taken a little water, but apparently had coughed it out. He was all right. Derek. The words slammed into him. Somehow he had forgotten. He stood. His legs were a bit wobbly, but they held, and looked down at the river. It stretched away for half a mile, becoming more calm and peaceful as it dropped, nestled in trees and thick brush, a blue line in a green background. Birds flew across the water. Ducks swam. There was no raft. Brian turned, stood dripping, looking upriver into the rapids. From below, they did not look as bad. The pressure waves appeared smaller. Even the boulder didn't seem as large. There was still the sound of water, although that, too, was muted. But there was no raft. No Derek. "Derek!" he yelled, knowing it was futile. He looked down river again. There was no way the raft would have stopped in the rapids. It had to have come down, floated on downstream. What had he seen? He frowned, trying to remember what had happened. Oh, yes, the wave. The big submerged rock in the wave. The great wave that had taken the raft, and he had seen that. The raft moving down river. He did not think it had tipped. He seemed to remember that it was upright. But Derek. Was he still on the raft? He couldn't remember for certain, but it seemed that he was. Everything was so confused. Tumbling in the rapids seemed to have shaken his brain loose. He fought panic. Things were what they were. If the raft rolled, or if Derek fell off the raft, then that was it. If not, Derek might still be all right. I have to figure out if he's still alive. And if Derek was still on the raft, still alive, he was downriver. Brian had to catch the raft. He started to move along the bank and did well for 50 or so yards. The bottom was gravel, spilled out by the rapids, but then it ended. The river moved rapidly back into flatter country, swamps, lakes, and the first thing that happened was the bottom turned to mud. Brian tried to move to the bank and run, but the brush was so thick and wild that it was like a jungle. Grass, willows, and thick vines grabbed at him, holding him. He moved back into the river, where the mud stopped him. If he tried to walk, when his weight came down, his feet sunk and just kept on going. 2, 3 feet. The mud was so thick it pulled his right tennis shoe off, and when he groped to find it, the mud held his arm, seemed to pull at him, tried to take him down. He lost his shoe, clawed back to the bank, and knew there was only one way to chase the raft. I'll have to swim. But how far? It didn't matter, he thought. Derek was down there somewhere. Brian had to catch him. He shook his head, took off his remaining shoe, and left it on the bank. He kept his pants on. They were not so heavy, and entered the river, pushed away from the bank until he was far enough out to start floating a bit. He kicked off the mud and began to swim. Within 3 strokes, he knew how tired he was. His whole body felt weak and sore from the beating he'd taken in the rapids, but he could not stop. He worked along the edge, half swimming, half pushing along with his feet in the mud, down river. He had to catch the raft. Chapter 23. He became something other than himself that afternoon. When he began to swim, after he'd overcome the agony of starting and his muscles had loosened somewhat, he tried to think. The raft would move with the current, if it did not get hung up. Brian would also move with the current, plus he had the added speed of swimming, and he should gain rapidly. But when he rounded that first bend and did not see the raft, and cleared the next bend 200 yards further and did not see the raft, worry took him. He stopped at the side and stood as much as he could in the mud. It was nearly a quarter of a mile to the next bend, and there was no raft. Every muscle in his body was on fire. He slipped back into the water and began swimming again, taking long, even strokes, kicking and pushing along the mud, pulling himself forward. Another bend and another, always reaching, and always Brian's eyes sought the still form, the thatched top of the raft. Nothing. The river seemed to have swallowed Derek. Altogether, he rounded 6 shallow bends, and there was no raft. The stupid raft had hung up on every bend when he was trying to steer it, and now perversely held the center of the river somehow. There was nothing but the green wall along either side, the trees that grew higher and higher now that the rock hills were passed, until they nearly closed over the top of the river. The green wall that always closed in and covered him as he slid along the water, wanting to scream, but pulling instead. Always pulling, a stroke, then another stroke, until there was not a difference between him and the water, until his skin was the water and the water was him, until he was the river and he came to the raft. He nearly swam past it. Brian moved near some willows, his face down in the water, reaching with his left arm, and when he raised his head, he was looking at the raft. It had somehow come through all the bends and curves, and here must have caught a slight cross-current. The raft had moved to the outside of the shallow curve and had glided back beneath some overhanging willows and low trees. All that showed was the rear end of the raft and the bottom of Derek's shoes. "Derek!" Brian's hand has almost brushed the raft, but he had not looked up at the exact point that he would have missed it. He grabbed the raft, pulled himself up alongside. Derek lay still, though his body had moved, twisted sideways on the raft. "Derek," he said again softer. Derek's head was still to the side, his eyes half open, but if he had been pushed underwater in the rapids, even for a moment, it might be too late. Derek. He looked gone. He looked done, gone, dead. Brian tried his wrist but could feel no pulse. He watched Derek's chest but didn't seem to move. He leaned down and put his ear against Derek's mouth, held his breath. There. Softly on his ear, a touch of breath. Once, then again, small puffs of air. Derek. He was still alive. Still alive. It was as if everything came loose in Brian at the same time. His body, his mind, his soul were all exhausted, and he fell across Derek, asleep or unconscious, with his legs still in the water. Derek.